Hello, and welcome to the Revictions Podcast, episode 19. My name is Nathan, and today, this episode is going to be kind of a follow-up to episode 17 and 18, where I talked about your mindset, I talked about perspective, I talked about how a change in your perspective and your mindset is going to bring about a change in your actions, and therefore is going to bring about persecutions. So today is kind of a way I wanted to tie the knot on that and talk about change in our lives, talk about how we can adapt and how we can overcome and how we see biblical examples of this. Because I think right now, in today's day and age, we need to change more, we need to adapt more, we need to overcome more. Personally, for me and what I see around my immediate self is a lot of people kind of kicking our feet up, so to speak. You know, we're just kind of watching our lives go by, or we're busy, you know, getting into the weeds. And it's like we're getting so busy that our troubles, our tribulations are kind of, you know, piling on top of themselves. They're almost going ignored. And when it gets to that point, we're eventually going to break down, and we're going to go to God, of course, with our prayers and with our petitions. And we're going to be looking to Him to make a miracle, to make a change in our lives. But what I wanted to bring to the table today is that we need to be the change in our own lives. If we're expecting God to come to the table for us, then we absolutely have to have the resolve to at least meet Him there. So if you're looking for God to change something for you, then you absolutely better be prepared to change something about yourself. And along with that comes the need to be able to adapt and overcome whatever those changes might be. So even though we spent a lot of time in the book of Matthew recently, I wanted to get into the book of Nehemiah today. So we'll be going to the Old Testament, and we'll circle back to the book of Matthew in a couple different areas to see how New Testament, Old Testament still absolutely comes together as one to give us the complete message of God. So today we're going to be starting in Nehemiah Chapter 4. To provide some context about Nehemiah Chapter 4, it's at this point where the Israelites are coming together to rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the city, rebuild the walls, everything about it. And in particular, what we learned in Nehemiah is they were really coming together to start rebuilding the walls, which had been essentially completely destroyed. The gates were burned down, and for cities in those days and age, having a protected wall around your city is probably the most important thing for you to do, just to be protected in general. So that's where they started first in the book of Nehemiah. And as they started this project, there was actually a few neighboring, people, a few neighboring towns, peoples who were very mad at the prospect of the Jews trying to rebuild the wall, and we'll see that here in just a few minutes. But before I get into what I really wanted to talk about today, I wanted to draw this quick lesson here that my eyes were just drawn to when I was actually writing out my notes for this episode. When Nehemiah first came to the city of Jerusalem, the first thing he did was he did a survey of all the major gates, all the major roadways, to see where essentially the project needed to start first, you know, the worst areas, the best areas. And after he did that, you know, he came back to the people who were actually going to be working on the wall, and they decided to start with the gates. And from the gates, they built out and connected the rest of the walls. If you want to think about it, the gates, right, the roadways, the walls, those are the things responsible for everything coming and going from the city, the entrances. So they didn't start with the buildings, they didn't start with the market, they didn't start with people's homes, they didn't start with the bank, they started with the walls, they started with the gates. So they started with the one thing that was going to prevent or allow entry and exit from the city. If we wanted to look at this into perspective, especially what we learn in the New Testament, our bodies are a city. More particularly, our bodies are a temple. And the one thing that the Lord tells us to protect over and over again is our eyes and our ears, which function as the gates to our body. So what I'm trying to say here is Nehemiah saw the destruction of Jerusalem and said, hey, we need to start with the gates. We need to start with what's controlling coming in and out of the city before we can even consider working on the interior. So what I'm saying here is if you've been struggling with something, or you're trying to work on something, or you're trying to change something about your life right now, you need to consider if you have properly protected your gates and your walls. Are you controlling what's coming in and out of your city? And what I'm saying is, what are you watching? What are you looking at? What kind of content are you consuming? What music are you listening to? If you've been praying to God for change, but you haven't actually adjusted what you are allowing into your life that's outside of God, then you might want to look at that first as a consideration before anything can actually happen on the interior and start bringing true change about your life. And I think that just in general is a very good rule of thumb when you're really trying to address, personal change, emotional change, spiritual change in your life. So now that we have that initial segue done and complete, let's go ahead and jump into Nehemiah chapter 4 and kind of look at how, what I was saying before, we had a couple different peoples who were against the Israelites trying to rebuild the city. And we see them now voicing that opinion very abruptly to the Israelites. And here's what they have to say in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1. But it so happened, when Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, that he was furious and was very indignant and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren in the army of Samaria and said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a few days? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned?" So as soon as the Israelites started placing the stones again, getting back to work again, they instantly were being mocked by these people around them, right? The neighboring towns, villages, and everyone else. They were mocking them. And even when they were just in the planning stage in the earlier chapters, they were still mocking them at just the idea of what they were doing. So now they're working, and now they're really trying to mock them on what they're trying to perform for the Lord. And mind you, Nehemiah was charged to do this work specifically. So this ties back into what I was saying in episodes 17 and 18, which relates back to a change in your mindset. And a change in your mindset will bring about a change in your actions. And a change in your actions is naturally going to bring persecution into your life because you're no longer acting like the rest of the world. The Jews here in this example represent that perfectly, because up until the point of them rebuilding the wall, Nehemiah specifically repented on behalf of everyone and was trying to make it known that, he was just really lamenting himself before the Lord, giving himself to the Lord in apology and repentance. So that repentance brought about, an attitude change and a change in direction and a change in action, which has now brought about the rebuilding of the wall. And once they started rebuilding the wall, that's when the persecution came. So it wasn't until that they tried to separate themselves, literally, physically, and spiritually, by rebuilding the wall, that now the world is really trying to come and reject them for who they're even standing for. And in verse 3, we get introduced to the next character who says, "Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, 'Whatever they build, even if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall.'" But check out this response of Nehemiah after he had heard this mockery himself. "Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn the reproach on their own heads, and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity, and do not let their sin be blotted out from before you. For they have provoked you to anger before the builders." So in a way, Nehemiah is telling him, hey, you can mock us all you want, but it's not me who's going to be casting judgment on you. It's going to be the Lord that you ultimately answer to, because we are simply his builders. We are simply here acting in accordance to his will and the work that he told us to do. So this is what it goes on to say in verse 6. "So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed. And they became very angry, and all of them conspired to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion." So first, the plans of the enemy just started out with mockery. They're just making fun of them, right? They're saying everything you do won't amount to anything. A simple fox will tumble the wall. But now they see that the work is actually making a difference. They see that the work is making progress. So they're switching from now emotional attacks, and they're switching to quite literally physical attacks on the people of Israel. So their tactics are changing here because the work that the Israelites are doing is becoming more prominent. Here's how the people respond to the threat of attack. They say, "Nevertheless, we made our prayer to God, and because of them, we set a watch against them day and night." So here's the first thing they did. They prayed to God. Just like Nehemiah did earlier, under the first attack of mockery emotionally. They prayed to God again, and they said, we must do this work no matter what. So we're going to pray to God that he's going to answer our needs. And while we're doing that, we're going to work even harder. So we have to set up a watch team now to make sure that we can be prepared to face this attack should it come. Now in verse 10, this is what it says. Then Judah said, the strength of the laborers is failing, and there is so much rubbish that we are not able to build the wall. And our adversaries said, they will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease. So we have two things happening. They were making great progress. The people had a mind to work. And then all of a sudden, once they're having to work harder and more, they have watch teams going out, they start to lose motivation. They start to lose confidence in what they're doing, thinking that the wall's never going to be finished. And in the midst of all of that, now we have their enemy who said they're going to attack them, and now they're receiving reports that they're not just going to attack them, but they're going to attack them when they least expect it. So as their motivation's at an all-time low, as their endurance is at an all-time low, on top of this, now they're having to face threatening attacks from the enemies, and they're not even sure when it's going to happen, regardless if they have that watch team out or not. So this ties back actually directly into episode 17, where I talked specifically on to be as wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. The wisdom that the people need here to be aware of is that the enemy wants to attack them. The enemy wants to kill them at a moment when they are least expecting it. And so to be wise, they have to do something in response to that information. And here's how they came across that information. In verse 12, it says, so it was, when the Jews who dwelt near them came, they told us 10 times, from whatever place you turn, they will be upon us. So these Jews just happened to hear the conversations of this plan that they were going to be attacked by Sanballat, Tobiah, and all of their other groupies who are trying to come and prevent the Israelites from building this wall. I don't think that was happenstance at all. I think God 100% intended for those people to be there, to hear that, to then report it back to the people who were building the wall so they could tell them about it. It wasn't by accident. It was 100% by design. So God gave them the information. God gave them the wisdom so that they can then make the decision from there of what they need to do next. Because even though they're at their lowest low of motivation and everything else, here's what they do. Therefore, I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall, at the openings, and I set the people according to their families with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. First connection to Matthew here, Matthew 10:24. Jesus says, is it not enough for a servant to be like their master? And what he's referencing there is we serve God, so it is enough for us to be like God, like Jesus, like him in the way that he walked this earth. And then he says, therefore, likewise, you do not need to fear them. And he's referencing men in this case, specific to the Pharisees and the Sadducees in spreading the gospel, right? We don't need to fear him because our master, who we serve, is greater and above all the rest of them. Nehemiah pretty much says the exact same thing here. He says, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord. You see, these men, they were on their kingdom task. They knew what they were doing. They knew why they had to do it. They knew that they had to do it. So they didn't ask God to build the wall for them. They didn't ask God to defeat their enemies who are now trying to attack them to prevent them from building this wall. They didn't ask God to lay the bricks for them. They didn't have to because God asked them to build the wall. He put them on that task. So he wouldn't put them there just to set them up to fail. So what do? Knowing that they had to build the wall because God tasked them to do that, they adapted. They changed to the situation and they overcame it. They said, okay, so not only now do we have to build this wall, even though we're at our lowest point in motivation, lowest point in endurance, now it's take up arms, now it's take up shifts, and still continue building the wall. So we're on our kingdom task here. We have to work even harder. We have to go even further than what we were doing before. And since they responded like this, look at what happened to the enemy. And it happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had brought their plot to nothing, that all of us returned to the wall, everyone to his work. Once the enemy knew or found out that the Israelites were aware of their attack, prepared for their attack, they were frightened. Because what was taking place is they were building the wall, which was a spiritual representation of their faith in God, while they are also physically preparing themselves, swords, shields, spears, and everything else. These innocent men, because they placed their faith in God, became a force to be reckoned with. They moved from builders to soldiers. And they took this assignment absolutely in stride, because here's what happens next. So it was, from that time on, that half of my servants worked at construction, while the other half held the spears, the shields, the bows, and wore armor. And the leaders were behind all the house of Judah. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked at construction, and with the other held a weapon. Every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built, and the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. So when they were faced with adversity, they adapted to the situation, postured themselves with knowledge and wisdom from God, and they made a stance under God's authority that what they were doing was the right thing to do because God asked them to do it. So let me bring us back to the beginning here when I was talking about change. This whole theme is about change, adapting, and overcoming, and tie that back to everyone here on earth, because everyone here on earth has a kingdom assignment. If you are a believer in Christ Jesus, then you are a member of the body, and every body has a function, every member a purpose, a function, and assignments that you have to do, some small, some large. It doesn't matter. But there is something on this earth that God has absolutely called you to do. So when it comes time to execute that, you can't stop because an obstacle falls in your path. Obstacles are going to fall in your path. You can't stop because the path turned all of a sudden and you don't know which direction to head in anymore. You can't stop because there's threats. You have to be willing to change. You have to be willing to adapt and overcome because you're on an assignment that you've been assigned to do. So you absolutely have to be willing to do extra, go further, work harder, because it's not the men you fear, it's the God that you serve that you should actually be fearing. Like I said at the beginning, if you kick your feet up because an obstacle appeared, and let's just say you have to have a bridge built. So you're praying to God, Lord, I need you to build this bridge for me so that I can make it across. You're the one being complacent. You're asking for a change in your life, and yet you're the one capable of making that change happen or being the change in your life. So when the obstacle appears, I think we have the habit to say, oh, God, can't do this anymore. This thing came up. It's in my way. Can you move it, Lord? Probably have a shovel over there on our left. Maybe we got a pickaxe over there on our right. We can start whittling away at it, break it down. Someone else might come along the way, asking for some help. But we can absolutely keep on moving, keep on adapting, keep on changing to the situations that are around us. The builders of the wall for Jerusalem, they weren't soldiers, but they became soldiers. Sword in one hand and a hammer in the other. And if they didn't do that, that wall would never have been rebuilt at all. So let me bring us to a close here and kind of wrap up the message for the week of changing your perceptions, changing your mindset, then changing your actions in your life. The actions in your life is going to cause persecutions to come against you. And because you have persecutions coming against you, you have to be prepared for it. You have to be ready for it. You absolutely have to be expecting it. Because keep in mind, the builders of the wall, they were motivated at first. They said everyone had a mind to work. And then as time went on, the threats went on, the mockery went on, they lost their motivation. They lost their endurance. And it was then that the physical attacks now are being threatened against them. So they didn't break down and stop. They didn't say, oh, I guess we can't do this anymore. They didn't expect God to fight their battles for them, though he was fighting alongside them. They decided to dig in, said, okay, hey, this is our situation now. Seems like we got to go a little bit harder. Seems like we got to go a little bit longer. Seems like we have to do a little bit more. Because the thing about it was this. These men had inward faith in God. They feared God, and that had an outward reaction to their world around them. Because of that faith, because of that fear, because of who they wanted to serve, they knew they had to do anything and everything possible to complete the task at hand. So in this case, it was the men who laid the bricks, who built the gates, but it was God who worked the miracle. Because like I said, I can assure you, without his hand on that project and on those men who are making it happen, that wall would not have been rebuilt. So what I'm trying to say here is this: we can't get into the habit of kicking our feet up and just expecting God to clear our path for us. What he actually wants us to do is to roll up our sleeves, get to work, start making changes in our lives, grow closer to him, and all these things that we've been trying and hoping for and praying for, they're going to start working themselves out. So let me conclude by saying this: instead of praying to God to bring something miraculous, a miraculous change about in your life, it's time to roll up your sleeves and start to bring that change yourself, and God's going to meet you there in that moment. So with that, I appreciate you listening to another episode. If you like this new format, if you're listening on YouTube and saw the video, thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow on the various channels that are out there, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you're listening on. I appreciate you, and I hope to see you in the next episode as well. Thanks.